Welcome into Words with Wallace. I'm your host, Nick Wallace, coming at you. It is Saturday, November 23rd. What is up, everybody? How are we enjoying the NBA season so far? Pretty good shooty hoops, if I do say so myself. I feel like we've had some exciting moments so far, a lot of which we're going to talk about at the top of this podcast. Hard to believe we're already a month into the season. It's definitely flying by. And we're far enough into the season at this point where we have some teams and some fan bases, more importantly, that are very disappointed with how their teams have performed in the young season so far. So, as you can tell by the title of this episode, today we are going to be ranking the biggest disappointments of the young NBA season. So, what teams have been the biggest disappointments compared to their preseason expectations? Because there's been quite a few. A lot of those teams are in the Eastern Conference. I'll spoil it a little bit, but we are going to fly through the top 5 most disappointing teams, so stay tuned for that. But before we get into that, we do have quite a few NBA headlines to talk about over the past week and a half since the last time I recorded. First and foremost, I would be remiss to not mention my Boston Celtics beating the best team in basketball, which shockingly is not the Celtics. No, it is the Cleveland Cavaliers, who were 15-0 at the time they faced off against my Boston Celtics on Tuesday. And I wanted to talk about it, man. That was a super fun game. It was just cool, I should say, before I get into the Celtics taking care of business, giving the Cavs their first loss of the season. Like, it was just really cool to have a regular season game this early on into the season that actually felt like a playoff atmosphere. And I don't know if that was just because of the, relatively historic start to Cleveland, right? I think they were, 15-0. So I think the only team that had a better start to the season was like the 2016 Warriors, which were the best team ever. I think they won like 24 games in a row or something like that to start the season. Just nuts. So 15-0 is definitely rare territory that the Cavs were in. Their first matchup with the Celtics came during the NBA Cup in Boston. And even though my Celtics came on top 120 to 117, I definitely have to give the Cavs a lot of credit to start things off, right? Because first and foremost, I think the deck was somewhat stacked in favor of my Boston Celtics outside of the obvious missing Kristaps Porzingis, which again, you really can't use that as an excuse at this point. We knew we were going to be without Kristaps until basically Christmas before the season, although I have been encouraged by like the clips of him warming up with the team and shooting around before the games and whatnot. But that being said, I do have to admit, like, look, the Celtics were playing at home, again, as I mentioned, playing in Boston. The Cavs were pretty shorthanded in this one. They were missing Dean Wade, Isaac Okoro, Max Strus, and Karis LeVert. And they also had a little bit less rest than the Celtics in this one. And obviously all the pressure is still on the Cavs in this one, right? Going into enemy territory, facing off between the hottest team in basketball against the defending NBA champs and what most people consider the best team in basketball, even though the record might not show it for the Celtics. I mean, they only have 3 losses themselves, but it was a really fun game. It definitely didn't disappoint. Came down to the wire. Both teams definitely treated it like a playoff game, whether that was because of the NBA Cup or everything that the game meant. They both had 8-man rotations, and the Cavs stuck it out despite everything being stacked against them that we already talked about, right? In addition to being banged up, in addition to playing on the road with less rest, they got a really miserable Darius Garland game. Like, he was just off all game long. Finished the game 3 of 21 shooting. And so the fact that the Cavs were even able to hang in this game, like, really awesome performance from Donovan Mitchell. He always seems to torch the Celtics. But obviously the better team won that night. I do think the Celtics deserved to win the game. If I had to give a player of the game out to somebody on the Celtics, I would definitely give it out to Al Horford. It is nice to know because we've obviously been reducing Al's minutes pretty significantly this season, right? Like, Keita has come on pretty strong. Luke Cornett and Tillman have been contributing as well. So even without Kristaps Porzingis, like, we're not putting too many miles on Al, but it was nice to see in like the biggest game of the season for the Celtics so far that immediately Al steps up. He plays a lot more minutes. He ends up finishing the game with 20.7 rebounds and 3 blocks, which were all really timely blocks, I must say. Like, 2 of those blocks coming in like the final 6 minutes of the game, if I'm not mistaken. I think both of them were against Darius Garland, or I know he blocked Garland at least twice during the game. And so, like, impressive chase down blocks by Al that always, like, all 3 of those blocks turned into points the other way for the Celtics, which right there, like, that swings an entire game. So that being said, just really happy to have a game that mattered. I think that was really good for the NBA. It was good for the NBA Cup, and ultimately it was good for my Boston Celtics as well, just because the Celtics had already lost an in-season tournament game like we talked about a little bit on the previous episode, in which they lost to the Atlanta Hawks at home by 1 point. So now that the Hawks have a loss in the in-season tournament, the Cavs have a loss in the in-season tournament, that group is completely up for grabs. So I'm still very much expecting, when it's all said and done, that the Cavs and the Celtics both end up making it and advancing to the single elimination tournament. I think that would be the best case scenario, getting the two best teams from the Eastern Conference to advance to Vegas. But we will see once we get a little bit closer to that. So moving on to some other news before we rank the most disappointing teams in the NBA so far. De'Anthony Melton for the Golden State Warriors ended up tearing his ACL, and he is going to be out for the season. And this is a pretty big bummer for the Golden State Warriors, who are still, at the time of recording this, the number one seed in the Western Conference. Melton, as I talked about before, was really the only guy in the offseason that I really believed in the fit in Golden State. Like, obviously, some of their other offseason acquisitions, like Buddy Hield has been crushing it. Kyle Anderson's been quite good as well. Like, everybody's been solid. But personally, I was the most excited about Melton as like a fit in the backcourt, with Steph Curry being such a great defender, being able to shoot and space the floor as well. Like, I just have always really liked Melton. And it's a shame because with him tearing his ACL, now he will have played in a total of 44 games over the past 2 years. I mean, he's only 27 years old, so I expect him to get a contract from somebody, even though he is going to hit unrestricted free agency this offseason. But it is a huge bummer. I will say, if anybody can afford to lose somebody in their rotation, it's probably a team like the Warriors that was already running like a 10 or 12 man rotation depending on the night. Like, this should open up more minutes for Gary Payton and Moses Moody and all the other guards like Brandon Podziemski, all these guys that they have on the bench that are deserving of more minutes. Lindy Waters, the pickup in the offseason as well, who was shooting the hell out of the ball early in the season. Like, the Warriors have a lot of guys, so they'll be fine, but I still think that's definitely reduces their ceiling overall, losing a guy like Melton. So, moving on to some other news, we were missing Jokic for I think it was like 4 or 5 games, because I didn't know why he was out, which we'll talk more about in a little bit, but it ended up being the birth of his child. I think he had a son, so congratulations to Jokic. He was back and played an awesome game against the Mavericks, picked up right where he left off, even though the Nuggets ended up losing that game. But Jokic is just incredible. I had so much fun really dialing in, watching a full Jokic game from start to finish in that game against Dallas in the in-season tournament last night. That was a lot of fun. Wemby is finally back in action today, like right at the time of recording this. They're about to tip off. He's finally back after missing several games with a knee contusion. And I do think it's really funny. Like, I'm obviously a big fantasy football guy. I've mentioned it a few times on this podcast, and don't pretend to know anything about football. That's why I don't talk about like X's and O's or have a football podcast or even do anything fantasy related on this feed. But I am an avid fantasy player, so like I'm staying on top of injury news. I'm setting my lineups. I'm in a bunch of leagues. And it's so funny, the difference between like the injury updates for the NFL compared to the NBA. Like, Wemby missed like 3 games, and I'm out here like scouring the internet trying to figure out what the hell happened to the guy. Like, maybe it said knee or something like that, but there wasn't any detail. There wasn't any timeline. It was just like, yeah, guess he missed that game against the Hawks. Like, maybe he'll be back next game. And it's like, meanwhile, like, we know every single update on like DeAndre Swift's groin, and he's on like a 4-8 football team at this point in the season. And like, it's just very funny, like how we get like up to the second updates on every single skill position in the NFL because of the fantasy and the gambling implications that come along with that. And the NBA, it's just like, we'll see what happens when they roll out the Spurs tomorrow. We just have no updates. So that's my frustration. Maybe if there's some other news or injury source that I'm missing, you guys can definitely let me know. But just wanted to vent about that real quick. I had no idea what was happening with Jokic. He was just out for personal. Wemby, like, these aren't B-list guys in the NBA by any means. Like, Wemby was just out. We had no updates, but whatever. I'm glad to see both Jokic and Wemby as of tonight taking the court yet again. Some other news around the NBA is Franz Wagner has just been absolutely balling in the absence of Paolo Banchero. I was really worried about the Magic. Like, I didn't even pick them to advance from their group in the NBA Cup because I just felt like the Orlando Magic were really pushing it as far as offensive options, even with Paolo, like losing their primary source of offense, losing a really talented isolation scorer and a guy who was dominant to start the season. Like, I had just kind of written off the Magic as far as being a really competitive team until Paolo's back in action, which hopefully will only be a couple more weeks at this point. But like, Franz has really stepped up. They're still the 3 seed in the East, I should add. Like, they have a stranglehold of that spot. I think the Knicks are right behind them. They're still significantly behind the Cavs and the Celtics, of course. But you got to be happy if you're the Magic and you're losing your best player and you still are the 3 seed early on this season. It's really stark, the difference in Franz's stats compared to him without Paolo, compared to the first couple games of the season where they had Paolo. I mean, he's up to 25-6-6 without Paolo when he was just 18-4-3 with Paolo during the month of October. And I think the biggest, most encouraging sign that we've seen from Franz Wagner is that the 3-point shooting has come back significantly. Last year, he just had a really down shooting year in which he finished the season shooting 28% from three. He's up to 35% from three right now, which is just really encouraging. That's something the Magic desperately need as well. They're not a great three-point shooting team, so you need that extra floor spacing. And he's been shooting the ball with confidence. I don't know if you guys stayed up late, or at least I tried to stay up very late for the game against the Lakers the other night. It was in Los Angeles. It was like a 10:30 East Coast start. And it was an awesome game. I mean, it came down to the wire. Anthony Davis ends up missing two clutch free throws, and it sets the Magic up where they have the ball down two with a few seconds left in the game. And Franz takes a step back three with confidence, absolutely drills it. And the Magic end up beating the Lakers on the road. And it was an awesome Anthony Davis game. It sucks that he choked and missed those clutch free throws. But just really impressed with what I've seen from Franz for a team that was really devoid of offensive options. I just wanted to highlight how dominant he's been. And I'm not saying he's going to average 25 points per game the rest of the season, but hopefully this is encouraging. Like, man, like they can afford to use Franz as much as they are right now, even when Paolo returns. Like, there's enough offense to go around with those two guys being the helm, you know, kind of replicating some of what the Celtics are doing with two dominant wings, even though the Magic guys are a bit bigger. Really like what I'm seeing out of Orlando. The Mavericks, I should mention as well, have bounced back with 4 straight wins after a really tough stretch like we talked about on the last podcast. That includes a massive win last night, like I already alluded to, in which they beat the Nuggets. The Mavericks went on the road without Luka, I should mention, who's out for, I think, another week at this point with a wrist injury. These injuries just keep on piling up for the stars in the NBA. But the Mavericks have turned it around. They've righted the ship at least a little bit. It's still really loaded in the Western Conference like you would expect, so they have a lot of work to do to climb up the seedings, but it's still very early. As long as they've been able to show that they've gotten contributions from their role players, like I think the Mavs are really well positioned in the Western Conference. Like to not have Luka, like all the guys that they picked up in the offseason are performing well. Kyrie is playing really consistent basketball. Like there's just a lot to like in Dallas, even if they struggled to win some close games as of a couple weeks ago. And then finally, it is worth noting while the Suns were really hot to start the year, they lose Kevin Durant, and predictably they've lost 5 straight games. So the Suns have taken quite a hit in the standings. That being said, they were already well positioned. I think they were right there with Golden State at the time of Kevin Durant's injury. So it's not too shocking that the Suns are kind of like a house of cards, if you will, where they're going to need at least Durant and Booker to be healthy in every game to be competitive. And it just shows you how valuable Kevin Durant is to that team, even at this stage of his career. So that does it for the headlines. Let's move right into ranking the most disappointing NBA teams of this season. Now, before I get into this exercise, obviously I'm aware it's extremely early. Like, the casual fan has not even put on an NBA game for the first time all season. That's probably not going to happen for another month until Christmas, once people actually remember the NBA is back on. So I'm well aware could easily be overreacting to these teams, but I do just want to admit, like, this isn't like a super small sample size that we have here. We have a month of NBA games at this point, and if you go to ESPN, you go to the standings, and you see where your team's at, and you're really pissed about it, like, I wanted to give you this podcast to talk about that. Who are the most disappointing teams, first of all? Why have they been so disappointing? What has gone wrong with these teams? And how do I expect it to play out moving forward? Is there hope for these teams? How can they turn it around? What needs to happen? Let's get into all that. And so at number 5, I think, again, on the whole, this team has been pretty disappointing on the season. We have to talk about the Milwaukee Bucks. Now, they're 7-9 overall record-wise, and that's good for 6th seed in the Eastern Conference. So in totality, like, it doesn't look great, but seeding-wise, they're fine because the East has been such a dumpster fire. And I have to admit, the Bucks' vibes are much better than what the record suggests. And let's kind of dive into that a little bit. They started 2-9, and there was a lot of panic early on in the season, and they've been 5-1 since then. Including they're playing, like, basically as I'm recording this podcast, a home matchup against the Hornets. So I have to think the Bucks will make that 6-1 in their last 7 games, and hopefully they'll be able to continue to right the ship there because that's a pretty cake matchup at home against the Hornets. But Giannis is playing the best basketball of his career. Like, I never am going to doubt Giannis, especially he has not lost a step physically at all. He is just absolutely dominant. He's putting up better numbers this season than what he put up in his MVP season. And Dame really isn't shooting the ball well from 3. I think that's been a struggle and a pain point early on in the Bucks season. And so I do think we have a large enough sample size that even though Dame's got a little bit older, like, he's below 30% from 3. Eventually that's going to change with more attempts as he gets more into rhythm as the season goes on, even if he's not quite the same guy that we saw in Portland. And I think some of their role players are coming on as well. Like Taurean Prince and AJ Green are just lighting it up from 3. The spacing around Giannis has gotten better. But I still think while everything is meshing a little bit better for the Bucks and they're clearly going to be fine overall, I think the same concern that you had for the Bucks before the season is still there. It's overall just like a lack of youth and a lack of perimeter defense, right? Like, who is going to be their lockdown guy for perimeter guards and, perimeter wings that just are running the NBA at this point? Like, does it end up being a guy like Gary Trent, who's been solid for the Bucks? He's out there a lot. Like, I don't think Taurean Prince has that same defensive intensity that he did earlier stops in his career. Like, Andre Jackson's a really exciting, prospect. And I think youth-wise, he's one of the only guys that has that energy on the team as well. But it's like, is he going to be able to contribute enough on offense for Doc to feel comfortable with him out there? Does DeLon Wright play more than like 17 minutes a game? I don't really know. I think that that's always ultimately going to be the downfall of the Bucks, is just not having that youth, not having that perimeter defense. But in totality, they're going to be just fine. I'm really not worried about them in the East. Like, for them to be the 6th seed and they're under 500 is pretty funny. It just shows you the state of the conference as a whole. And just what I've seen from Giannis over the past couple games, like, they're going to be absolutely fine. They're ultimately going to finish as a top 4 seed. I'd be really surprised if they didn't. And so my panic meter, my overall concern with the Bucks is a 2. Like, I'm really not too worried about them, but I still wanted to talk about the Milwaukee Bucks just because you looked at the NBA standings for the first time all year and you saw that the Bucks were under 500 and Giannis has been healthy. Like, what's going on with that? That's why. They just had a really bad start to the season. Doc is going to be safe as well. I think I basically recorded my first podcast of the season when the Bucks were 2-9, and I said if the Bucks got to like 2-10, I thought Doc was going to be done for. But clearly they rebounded again. They ripped off like a couple games in a row, and now Doc is pretty safe, and the team's going to be just fine. So it is funny that they were towing that line where maybe they were going to make a coaching move, but ultimately, like, this is the roster that they have. The Bucks are locked in to this core. And with Giannis playing at the level that he's at, they're going to end up being just fine. So I think ultimately it's just going to be a footnote on the season that, hey, they started the season really bad, but ultimately the Bucks should be just fine. Moving on to the 4th most disappointing team of this young NBA season, the Minnesota Timberwolves. Now, they're not terrible. They actually have an over 500 record, but I feel like collectively the Timberwolves and Wolves fans out there are just like looking around and are like, did we fuck this up? Did we ruin a really awesome thing that we had in place last season? And that's definitely possible because right now they're 8-7, which again, that is not a bad record, but currently that has them at the 10 seed in the Western Conference, which is hilarious. But at the same time, it just shows how crazy competitive the West is right now. And you're looking at the teams above the Timberwolves and you're like, okay, who do they have to pass? Like, they still have to pass teams that are playing at a really high level right now. Like, maybe you think the Clippers at 10-7, like, they cool off a bit. But at the same time, they could also go the other direction if they end up getting Kawhi back at some point. Like, all the teams above the Timberwolves, like the Mavericks, the Grizzlies, the Suns, the Nuggets, the Clippers, Lakers, Rockets, Thunder, Warriors, like, all those teams are legit. Like, there's no obvious fluke in there where one of those teams is falling out. And that's not even mentioning teams like the Spurs and the Kings that are right behind the Wolves in the standings as well. So the West is going to be a dogfight. And if you're not playing good basketball from October through April, like, you could easily find yourself in the play-in race or even worse on the outside looking in. So I do think there's significant level of concern just where the Wolves are at this season. And it's not just their record, right? Like, they had a really ugly loss to the Raptors in their most recent game, in which there was a viral clip that everybody saw of, like, I think it was Julius Randle handling the ball on the perimeter and Rudy was posting up a smaller guy, calling for the ball. Randle just ignores him. And instead of like clearing the lane and relocating like Rudy should have done, he ends up just like walking out of the paint and getting called for a 3 seconds that ends up being a turnover. And the game was in Toronto, like that sparked the crowd, and then like things just kind of fell apart for the Wolves from there. Like, they just got pretty bad shots down the stretch, and the Raptors, credit to them, they got Scotty Barnes back. The home crowd had some juice with like their Vince Carter uniforms, and they got a pretty good win. So that was a tough loss for the Timberwolves to lose to the Raptors. Not to mention, they also had back-to-back losses to the Blazers, and one of those games was an NBA Cup game, like we talked a little bit about in the previous podcast. So why is this happening? Like, why are the Wolves significantly worse than what they were last season? And I think it starts with Donte DiVincenzo. I mean, he's really been struggling, averaging less than 10 points per game, shooting only 32% from 3, which I know that doesn't sound all that bad, but I believe Donte DiVincenzo was like 43% from 3 last season. Like, he was one of the league leaders in 3-point percentage. And not to mention, like, I don't want to be too anecdotal with this podcast, but I did watch the Raptors-Wolves game, and like, when they really needed a bucket with like 2 or 3 minutes left in the game, Ant just like kicked the ball out to a wide open Donte DiVincenzo, and he just bricks a 3. And you can just see Anthony Edwards' body language was terrible. Like, the rest of the team was just kind of dragging after that. Like, I understand that, like, you're going to miss open shots. That happens to even the best players in the NBA, but like, you can't be missing wide open clutch 3s like that. Like, this dude had all day to line up the seams and let it fly. And it's like, those are just the shots that Donte's been missing all year long. And even with Julius Randle producing, like, that guy's always going to get his stats. He's averaging 22 points, 7 rebounds a game. like even with him producing, he's not Karl Anthony Towns, right? Like Towns, as I expected, and I'm not even a big Towns guy, like it's just come in, statistically dominates for the Knicks, playing his more natural position at center, like being a really great stretch five. Like he's like 26 and 13 over for the Knicks. Like Randle on his own is not going to replace that production. So you really need Dante DiVincenzo to be a difference maker if you even want to come close to breaking even on the trade. And like, I have watched the Wolves quite a bit. I love watching them. And it just seems to me that on the offensive end of the court, like just seems like they're extra dependent on Anthony Edwards. Like Towns really gave them that floor spacing, that pick and roll dynamic that they just don't have without him. And the non-Ant minutes, while I know Ant is a superhuman guy, so he can play like 35 up to 40 minutes a game with no problem. But like the few minutes a game where it's not Anthony Edwards in there, like it's really gross. Like Mike Conley has clearly lost a step, so do you play more Rob Dillingham? I think that would be a reasonable pivot for Chris Finch to make it this time. Like let's just see what the rookie has. We've had some big rookie performances so far in this season that we'll talk more about later on in the podcast, but I loved what I saw from Rob Dillingham in the preseason and stuff like that. He's a super exciting, like instant offense type of player. Like what's the harm in throwing him out there in those minutes without Anthony Edwards? I don't know. Overall, like the team should still be fine. Like they're over 500. They need more time to gel. But even defensively, like their defensive rating, I think is like 15 on the season. And it just makes you ask the question, like, why did their defense get worse? Like you lose Karl Anthony Towns, who was a minus defender for most of his career. Like, is it a rebounding thing? Like you're losing Towns' rebounding presence and teams are getting more second chance opportunities? Like you add in Dante DiVincenzo, who's a great defender. Like why is the defense going from like all-time dominance, number one in the NBA to 15th? Again, with a sample size of a month, that's a little concerning. So ultimately, something has changed with Minnesota. Maybe it just stems from like the culture and the presence that Cat had in that locker room. He seemed to be really beloved. But for the Wolves to just be totally different and struggling a little bit early on in this season when they had a really good thing going for them, that is why I think it is so disappointing for the Wolves fans. I think they really miss Cat right now. There's plenty of time for them to turn this around, but I think there is some real panic. And I'd put the panic meter at like a 4. I think there's some real concern, but overall, you can't be too upset when you still have Anthony Edwards and you have an over 500 record. And ultimately, maybe I'm shitting on the Wolves right now, and then they play my Boston Celtics tomorrow, and this blows up in my face just like it did for the Warriors a couple episodes ago. So we will just have to stay tuned and see if that's the case. Moving on to the third most disappointing team in the NBA so far, we have to talk about the New Orleans Pelicans. Now, I know first and foremost that they have been crushed by injuries, so maybe this is a little unfair, but this is kind of a vibes thing on this point. And I saw a very damning video of Zion Williamson that came across my Twitter yesterday, so I felt the need to include them on this list. And so overall, they're 4-13. Like they are 5 games back of the 10 seed in the Western Conference. And I know it's very early, but like, goddamn, just like that exercise I did with the Wolves, naming all the teams in front of them, like, it's obviously even worse for the Pelicans being several seeds below the Wolves. And to be 5 games back of even being in the play-in race is really, really concerning for the Pelicans at this point. Now, I mentioned the injuries. How bad is it? Like, we've had Zion miss time, CJ McCollum, Trey Murphy, Herb Jones, Jordan Hawkins, Jose Alvarado have all missed significant time already in this season. Like they've had 18 different dudes wear a Pelicans uniform at some point this season, and we're not even in December yet. Like it has been truly like apocalyptic over there in New Orleans. So I must admit that they've had some really bad luck, but that's not the only reason the vibes are bad. Like the records are trash, the team isn't healthy. Not to mention like an extra salt in the wound here is that 2 former Pelicans last season have absolutely been flourishing with their new teams in their new roles. And those 2 guys that I'm talking about are Dyson Daniels and Najee Marshall. Dyson Daniels obviously was the centerpiece of that DeJounte Murray trade. Not only did the Pelicans have to give up some picks to get DeJounte Murray as well, but they also gave like Larry Nance and a couple other role players. But bottom line, Dyson Daniels has been lighting it up for the Hawks. Like he is, I think, up there as like one of the favorites for Defensive Player of the Year. Like he has to. Like I think I saw some stupid stat like a week ago at this point that Dyson Daniels had more steals in his previous 5 games than anybody else in the NBA did on the entire season. Like that dude was averaging like 6 or 7 steals a game for like a solid couple week stretch, and he's still just like leading the league in deflections. He's getting a lot of blocks. Like he is just a monster out there, and he hasn't even really put it together offensively yet. Like obviously his minutes have gone up a lot, so his points and his 3-point shooting is up a little bit from last season, but on the whole, Dyson Daniels just looks like his stock is soaring, and he is a massive pickup for that Hawks team right now. And Najee Marshall had what I believe was his best game as a Maverick last night in that massive win in the NBA Cup. on the road in Denver, and Najee Marshall was just like one of the only dudes that was consistently getting a bucket down the stretch for the Pelicans. Like, I swear he didn't miss. He's a monster on defense as well. Like, again, early sample size, I know, but from what I've seen from Najee Marshall, he really does look like a slight upgrade in that Derrick Jones spot. Obviously, he's not as crazy of an athlete as Derrick Jones Jr. was, but overall, the Mavericks has to be very happy with the decision to sign Najee Marshall. And then finally, we get to the Zion video. Now, I must admit, I'm probably being a little bit reactionary here because, first of all, I don't even know when this video was filmed, okay? It came across my Twitter yesterday, but it does look recent. And the caption, it was tweeted from like the Overtime account, was Zion's new back tattoo is crazy, right? So it's this like private video in Zion's home that I'm assuming somebody from his camp posted. I suppose it could be like the tattoo artist that posted it as well. So Zion's getting like a full back tat. You can, I'll reserve my opinions on the back tattoo. That's not exactly my cup of tea, whatever, right? But he's getting a back tattoo, so he's shirtless. And that's kind of the main thing here is like the team is struggling. Zion's out for several weeks with like a soft tissue injury. He injured his hammy. Now, again, every hamstring injury is different. People who are in great shape injure their hammies all the time. But if you're out of shape, you are certainly more likely to get a soft tissue injury like what Zion experienced with the hamstring injury. So you can connect the dots a little bit, and you see him in this video, and he looks in horrible shape. Like there's no getting around it. Like, obviously the main video is like focused on his back, but he like stands up and turns around, and like, look, I don't want to body shame anybody here. Like, I've seen the shirtless videos of like Patrick Mahomes, and he's like the best quarterback in the NFL. He's got like a dad bod. Like, I'm sure Luka and Jokic have like unforgiving bodies as well. But like, it's different when you watch Zion and he just doesn't seem like he's moving right. Like, it's been a long time story with him that he's not taking his health seriously. And everybody carries their weight differently. Like, LeBron's been jacked since he was like 12. And so I saw people doing the comparisons of like Zion as compared to LeBron at like 39. And LeBron's absolutely cut up to this day. And Zion looks in horrible shape at his young age. And so I get it. Like, you get into that game, it's a slippery slope. But I am just telling you, it looked bad. Like, the video looked bad. He's like getting a tattoo while watching anime. Meanwhile, they have somebody in the kitchen preparing this man like fried chicken on top of like an Alfredo pasta. And like, according to what I could tell in the video, like, it doesn't look like the healthiest portion. Looked like there were some pretty large plates there. And again, this could have been years ago. This could have been in the off season, or it could have been yesterday. I really don't know. I'm just telling you, I saw the video. And the results and the response from Pelicans fans on that video was hilarious. Like, they're like, get this guy off my team. Like, I'm so sick of this shit. Again, people are doing the side-by-side photos with LeBron. Like, the reception of that video was not positive. And the optics of it, with the team struggling and him being, maybe out of shape, suffering a soft tissue injury, like, it's just bad for Zion's stock. And frankly, zooming back in and getting to the team, like, where do they go from here? Like, how the hell are they going to climb out of this hole? I know it's not even December yet, but being that far back of the 10 seed in a loaded Western Conference, and Zion like has 1 year of his entire career, which was last year, where he played in more than like 60 games. He was up to 70 last year. Like, it just seems far-fetched that this team is going to put it together in time to make a real run this season, to even make the play-in race at this point, when I already had real question marks about the roster. I didn't know the fit of DeJounte Murray, who obviously, it's unfortunate for him. He like broke his hand in the first game of the season, so we haven't seen him yet. We don't know how he's going to mesh. We don't know if Zion's going to be back in shape or when he'll be back. They don't even have a center on the roster. They're running this like Evis Misi guy out there. Like, they have no bigs whatsoever. And I just think it has been a dumpster fire for the Pelicans. And the optics of that shirtless Zion video, which I did retweet from my podcast Twitter if you guys want to take a look at it, I just think it's really bad. It's really disappointing for a Pelicans team that, even though I didn't have high expectations for them, it feels like their season is basically over. Maybe I'm being reactionary here. You guys can let me know, but I'd put the panic meter for the Pelicans at like an 8. Like, I just don't see a world in which they climb out of this, and it's going to be an uphill battle for them to even get in the play-in race at this point in time. Moving on to the second most disappointing team in the NBA, in my opinion, we have the Indiana Pacers. Now, I don't think they've gotten a lot of national or media heat at this point in time. I think that's going to start up this week if I had to guess, because right now the Pacers are 6-10. They're the 11th seed in the Eastern Conference, and I know the East is a lot weaker, so the Pacers, it'll be much easier for them to get back in the thick of it in the Eastern Conference with teams like the Pistons above them, and the Hornets, I believe, are above them as well. Like, they have a reasonable way to get back into this thing. But the main concern with the Pacers is, like, what the hell happened to Tyrese Halliburton? He's currently, like, 4th on his own team in scoring, and I know he's a pass-first player. That's his whole MO. But to be 4th on your team in scoring when you were, like, an All-NBA player last year is pretty damning. Like, and his stats are down really across the board from last season. And I'm not even talking about, like, the fact that you really have to look at Tyrese Halliburton's season last year as two different seasons, right? The player he was up until January and the player he was after January. I think it was like the ankle injury, if I'm not mistaken. That's what kept him out for a little bit. And after he came back from that injury, and I believe it was like early February, right before the All-Star break, like he was just not the same guy at all. But even if you compare his season totals and season averages this year to the entirety of last season, it's really bad. Like, his stats are down significantly across the board. He's averaging 5 less points per game. He's averaging almost 3 less assists per game. And most importantly, his three-point shooting dropped from 36% to 29% on the season so far. And I think in general, like when we zoom in on Tyrese Halliburton's career, like obviously he made an All-NBA team last year. He's regarded as one of the best guards in the NBA. But when you really look at it, like how long can you milk this ankle injury for? Like that's what I want to know, because we really only have a 30-game sample size of him being an elite All-NBA talent, and the rest of the career is something else. Like obviously in Sacramento and his first year in Indy, like he showed signs and he was always like regarded as like a really valuable player and a valuable asset. But the sample size of him being like all NBA talent is only 30 games at this point. So I think we need to look at the rest of Halliburton's career and put him in that camp, because I do not think at this point in time he is a franchise changing player. Right now, and for the entirety of the time that he's been in Indiana, Pascal Siakam has been the best player on the Indiana Pacers, like point blank period. And so he really needs to figure it out and turn it around for this team to not have a chance in the Eastern Conference. Like they're going to make the playoffs or at least be a play-in team either way. But if they want to get back to being, having a home playoff series, to being a top 4 seed, being a top 6 seed, whatever, like they really need Tyrese Halliburton to turn it around, because the limited Pacers games that I've watched, it seems like everybody else is performing how you would expect, right? Like with the exception of Nembhard and Nesmith both missing a few games each, but like as we've talked about, every team in the NBA has already had to endure some type of injury. And so you look at Tyrese and you're asking what can he do differently? Like I think a lot of his struggles come down to shot selection, right? Not that he's even taking bad shots, but he is just always, even when he was playing at a really high level, was so dependent on his ugly ass jumper and that 3-point shot falling at a really high clip. And he's just not that type of shooter. Like he's not a Steph Curry. He's not even a Damian Lillard. Like he's just not that talented of a 3-point shooter. And the form, when you look at it, it kind of makes sense as well. And it's not even just that, like the 3-point shooting as a whole. It's just that once he gets in the lane, he doesn't have like a mid-range game. He's not finishing at the basket at a high level. Basically once he enters the arc, he's just looking to pass. And it just seems like teams have figured him out for better or for worse. And so I don't know if there's something Rick Carlisle can do to coach him up. I don't know if there's a schematic thing that they can change with his game. But clearly I don't like Tyrese Halliburton. I've never liked Tyrese Halliburton. I'll admit when I'm being a hater, and I kind of am right now. But I'll admit, I saw an interview of him after the game last night where he looked broken. Like the reporters, to give them credit, were asking him like real tough questions about how his performance, what has changed, what he thinks he can do to improve his play to get where he was last season. And the dude just looked defeated. Like he was like, I don't know how this gets better. I'm going to work to figure this out. Like I've been working with these guys, and we're trying to figure out a solution to this. Like, but the poor dude's confidence seemed absolutely shot. So I'm just saying, it's a really bad vibes in Indiana right now. I had them as an 8 seed before the season, and I think that that's exactly where they're going to finish. But I know a lot of people after that Eastern Conference Finals run had much higher expectations for the team, so I feel like they're really disappointing here. Like I think it's very likely that we could look back on, and I know it's way too early to say this, that Eastern Conference Finals run for the Pacers, and we look at it in the same light that we do the Hawks run a couple years ago, right? Like every once in a while, especially if you're in the weaker conference, there's a team that makes it one series away from the NBA Finals, and you're like, how the hell did they get there? Because they have not been a perennial contender in the conference, and I don't ever see the Pacers getting back to that point. I think even if Tyrese Halliburton figures it around, it's going to be really hard for them to catch Cleveland, Boston, Orlando, even Miami and Milwaukee. Like, I don't even think they pass any of those teams in the standings, so I think we're in for a disappointing Pacers season. And I would put the panic meter for the Pacers at about a 7, just because the record is a little bit better than the Pelicans, because they are in the weaker conference. Like, they're still going to have a chance for Tyrese Halliburton. They still have several months for him to get his confidence back and return to the same level of play. But if he doesn't, you can expect more of the same Indiana Pacers that we've seen so far this season. Finally, the most disappointing team in the NBA, and it is not even close, It is the Philadelphia 76ers, man. They are 3-12 right now. They are literally the second worst team in the NBA. Shout out the Wizards, man. But at least the Wizards had a plan. The Wizards went in there like, we are getting Cooper Flag, or at least doing everything we can to give ourselves the best chance of getting Cooper Flag. They've been tanking all season long, and they are the only team with a worse record than the Philadelphia 76ers. Let's start off by talking about the Joel Embiid injury news. He's only played in 4 games this season. His most recent game was against the Grizzlies, and even which he put up 35 points against the Grizzlies. Like, he looked horrible moving around out there. Like, it just looks so damn bad for Embiid when he's not healthy. It's really obvious, and I know he's trying to play himself back into shape here, but that game was an eyesore despite the final stat line. And after that game, it was announced that he is going to be out at least a few games to manage the swelling in his knee. And the main question I have for the Philadelphia 76ers is, why were they not more transparent about this guy's health before the season even started? Because I feel like it was just really frustrating for the fans for him to miss like the first, 5-10 games of the year or something like that. And then for him to come back clearly less than 100%. Like, it just is tough because now Embiid, it feels like he's disappointing his fan base. He feels like he has something to prove at even just getting out there and being healthy when he's clearly not. When you're playing a guy who's on the wrong side of 30, who's already had a lengthy list of injury history, like, how are you going to expect him to play at less than 100%? That is really dangerous for the state of your franchise, especially when you have him locked up under contract for several more seasons. So that's been really frustrating for the team. Paul George, who obviously got a bone bruise on his knee in the preseason, which looked really ugly. Felt like the team was pretty fortunate that he was able to only miss a couple weeks there. He finally came back, and he's been pretty slow starting the season. He's really only had one good game so far, and in that Memphis game got banged up again, suffered another bone bruise in his knee, which is going to keep him out a few games. Tyrese Maxey has missed some time as well. The trio of Kyle Lowry, Andre Drummond, and Eric Gordon just looks absolutely washed at this point. And again, I bring all this up just because I want to make it clear, when you're 3-12, it's not all the blame should be pushed over to Joel Embiid's injury and Paul George's injuries. Clearly there's other people that have underperformed as well. But the team does have a very obvious bright spot, which makes it even funnier, in my opinion, that the team is this disappointing, because they have arguably the rookie of the year so far in this young season with Jared McCain, who's been absolutely balling. Again, not a personal fan of Jared McCain, but he is averaging 26-5 over his last 5 games. He's shooting 43% from 3 on the season. All those TikToks got the boy feeling confident. That is one thing that guy does not lack. He lets it fly. He's been playing with, again, insane confidence out there. And so the Sixers have to be very happy with that selection. And it just, again, makes it even funnier that they're getting this insane production out of what was considered a very weak rookie class, and they are still struggling this much overall. And so how do the Sixers get out of it? How can they possibly pull themselves out of a 3-12 hole to start the season? I think moving forward, at least for the next 5 to 10 games, it needs to be all Maxey and McCain to carry this team. If you have Joel Embiid and Paul George on the wrong side of 30 with 3 and 4 years left on their contracts respectively, you really need to play it safe with those guys. You cannot afford a Paul George injury or a Joel Embiid injury that ends up being long-term, that keeps him out the entirety of the season. They just don't have the talent to compete without all of those guys playing at the same time. It's just really embarrassing that this team went all in the offseason, and I can't be too harsh on it, because in the moment, I liked all the offseason moves that they did. It felt like they got a real backup for Joel Embiid. Obviously, the draft pick panned out, the decision and the fit to get not only Paul George, but Caleb Martin as well, Gershon Yabusele. They did a lot of things around the fringes to improve what was a very weak bench for the Sixers last year, and they are just so much worse. And so I think the biggest advice I would give to Daryl Morey and Nick Nurse and the Sixers right now is to just let Embiid and Paul George rest. I know it's going to be ugly, but at least McCain and Maxey have the confidence in their roles to deliver. They know they're going to be the guys. They know they're going to be the ones taking the shots. You just got to hope that the role players around them can support them enough to you're not going to beat a Cleveland with a roster like that. You're not going to beat a Boston or an Oklahoma City or a Golden State. You're not going to beat any of those top teams, but can you beat up on the Pistons and the Wizards and the Hawks? Can you win those in the middle games to at least get you treading water, so that when ultimately Paul George and Joel Embiid do return, the team is at least the 12 seed in the Eastern Conference. You at least move up a few spots there. And then you're only 6 or 7 games behind 500, something like that. But you can't keep mailing in the same strategy. You can't keep trotting Joel Embiid out there and Paul George out there to expect them to put their cape on and deliver for this team when they're less than 100%. So ultimately, I think the panic meter for the Sixers, it has to be like an 8 at this point. It has to be pretty damn high, despite how early we are in the season. Just, again, because you went all in the offseason, because of the expectations for this team, and because 3-12 is really pathetic, and it's going to be tough to climb out of that, even in a weaker conference. So that does it for this podcast. Just to quickly recap my top 5 most disappointing teams in the NBA so far. At number 5, the Milwaukee Bucks. They have much better vibes than what their record suggests, so I don't think I'd be too panicked as a Bucks fan. Number 4, the Minnesota Timberwolves. A lot of their frustration just comes with the concern that they really messed up a good thing that they had in place last year. Number 3, the New Orleans Pelicans. They've had really terrible injury luck, a damning video of Zion Williamson. Not exactly sure how the Pelicans are going to climb even into the play-in race in the Western Conference. The second most disappointing team in the NBA, the Indiana Pacers. It just seems like Tyrese Halliburton is a completely different guy this season, and they're paying the price for it. And then finally, the most disappointing team, the Philadelphia 76ers, and their abysmal 3-12 start. So that is going to do it for this episode. I should be back next week as well, hoping to have a guest on my next podcast. I know it's been way overdue since the last time we brought a guest in on this feed, so hopefully we'll be breaking down one of the more exciting teams in the NBA. But if I don't talk to you guys before Thanksgiving, have a wonderful Thanksgiving. As always, very thankful for my Words with Wallace audience. Thank you for continuing to listen to this podcast, support all the episodes, support the social media content. Definitely means a lot. So I will let you guys go. Be sure to follow at Words with Wallace on everything. Again, support the Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you get your podcasts. Also on social media, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. And I will talk to you guys next week. Peace.